December 1968. The Mekong Delta. Deep in the swamp the Vietnamese called the Forest of Darkness, a single American is moving through black water, alone, hunted by men who have spent 5 years deciding exactly when to kill him. He has no weapon, no map, no name that anyone back home still expects to hear alive. For days he travels only when the water moves, freezing every time a voice carries across the reeds. You have almost certainly never heard of him, but every Green Beret, every Navy SEAL, every pilot and operator the United States sends behind enemy lines today is trained, line by line, on what this one man learned in that swamp. His name was James Rowe, and here is what almost no one will tell you. The 4 days you are about to follow are not even the hardest part of his story. They are the part that finally set him free. To understand what happened to him, you have to understand what the United States was doing in the Mekong Delta in the first place. In the early 1960s, the war in Vietnam had not yet become the war Americans would later recognize. There were no massed divisions, no nightly body counts on television. Instead, there were small teams of Army Special Forces, Green Berets, scattered across the countryside, living in mud-walled camps, training South Vietnamese militia to fight an enemy that wore no uniform and melted into the villages. James Rowe was one of them, a West Point graduate, a young lieutenant, an officer in the 5th Special Forces Group, sent to a camp called Tan Phu in one of the most dangerous corners of the Delta. On October 29, 1963, that camp pushed out on an operation, and the operation went wrong. A force of Viet Cong, far larger than expected, surrounded Rowe's element in the open paddies. The fight lasted until the ammunition ran out. When it was over, 3 Americans were alive and in enemy hands. Rowe, a captain named Humbert Versace, and a sergeant named Daniel Pitzer. They were not taken to a prison. There were no prisons here. They were marched deeper into the swamp, into a world with no walls, no guards and towers, and no one coming. How do you escape from a place that is not a building, but a wilderness that wants you dead? Rowe would spend the next 5 years trying to answer that question. His prison was a bamboo cage, barely long enough to lie down in, sunk in the flooded forest. His captors moved the camp constantly, melting from one stretch of swamp to the next whenever American aircraft came too close. The food was a few handfuls of rice a day. The water bred disease. Men around him died slowly, of dysentery, of infection, of simply giving up. And from the very first interrogation, Rowe understood that survival depended on a lie. He was an intelligence-trained Special Forces officer, exactly the kind of prisoner the Viet Cong would execute or trade. So he built a cover story, and he held it for years. He told them he was a draftee, an engineer, a man who built schoolhouses and bridges, who knew nothing worth killing him for. Every day was an interrogation he had to win. One wrong detail, one contradiction, and the story collapsed. He kept it standing for more than 5 years, inventing a whole false life and never once letting it slip, even as his captors tried to break him with isolation, with threats, with the slow erosion of starvation. He was not alone in his defiance. Captain Rocky Versace refused to cooperate so completely, cursed his captors so openly, and tried to escape so many times that they eventually marched him away into the forest and shot him. Versace would receive the Medal of Honor decades later, and after his death, for resistance that the United States military had no formal way to even describe at the time, because that was the buried truth underneath all of it. America was sending its best men into the most dangerous work on earth, and it had never seriously taught a single one of them how to survive being captured. There was no school for this. There was no doctrine. There were only men in cages, improvising the will to live, and dying when they ran out of it. Survival in that swamp was not only physical, it was a daily war for the mind. Rowe later described forcing himself to keep a calendar in his head, to exercise in the mud, to refuse the small surrenders that killed other men first, the man who stopped washing, the man who stopped speaking, the man who simply lay down and waited to die. The 3rd American taken with him, Sergeant Daniel Pitzer, would also survive, released in 1967 as a propaganda gesture. But Versace was gone, and the camps were full of men Rowe watched lose the argument with their own despair. He came to understand something the United States Army had never written down, that resistance is a skill, not a virtue, something that can be taught, rehearsed, and made to hold when everything else has been stripped away. Rowe did not simply endure, he tried to get out. Across his years in the swamp, he attempted escape more than once, slipping his cage, vanishing into the flooded forest, and each time the swamp itself defeated him. Without a map of the waterways, without contact with any friendly force, he would wander for days through identical walls of reed and water until the Viet Cong simply tracked him down and dragged him back, weaker than before. On one attempt, he made it further than all the others. Days of wading through the maze of canals, eating whatever he could find, navigating by the sun and the pull of the water, close enough to freedom to start believing in it. Then a patrol stumbled onto him, and the swamp closed again. The punishment for running was always the same: less food, tighter confinement, and the quiet promise that the next time would be his last. The forest was the perfect prison precisely because it had no edges. Every failed escape taught him something: how to read the channels, how to move at night, how to ration his strength, how long a starving man can push before his body quits. Then, late in 1968, the lie finally broke. Anti-war activists in the United States had publicly named Rowe as a Green Beret officer, and word of it filtered back to his captors. His engineer story was finished. The Viet Cong now knew exactly what he was, and they made the decision they had postponed for 5 years. They were going to execute him. He was told, in effect, that he had run out of time, so he made his last move with nothing left to lose. On December 31st, 1968, his guards were marching him through the swamp to a meeting that he understood would end with his death. Overhead, a flight of American helicopter gunships swept across the Delta. In the noise and the chaos, Rowe struck down the guard nearest him and ran out of the tree line into open marsh, waving his arms at the sky. The gunners saw a gaunt, bearded figure in black pajamas and nearly opened fire, certain he was Viet Cong. A crew chief looked again. The man was too tall. The beard was wrong. They dropped into the marsh and pulled him aboard. After 62 months, more than 5 years, James Rowe walked out of the forest of darkness alive, one of only a handful of Americans ever to escape that war from inside the enemy's own camps. He could have disappeared into a quiet life. Instead, Rowe did something that changed the United States military permanently, and then watched a part of it curdle into something he never intended. He had survived because he improvised everything the Army had failed to teach him. So in 1981, the Army brought him back to build the school it should have had all along. At Fort Bragg, Rowe designed and stood up a brutal new course called SERE: Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. It took everything he had learned in the swamp: how to live off nothing, how to evade trackers, how to resist interrogation without breaking, how to keep a cover story under pressure, and turned it into formal doctrine. Today, in some form, every American special operator, pilot, and high-risk soldier passes through training built on his captivity. That is not a legend. That is the literal origin of how the United States now prepares its people to be captured. But here is the part that almost no one connects. The resistance side of SERE required something disturbing. To teach Americans how to withstand torture, instructors had to subject students, under tight control, to a taste of the real thing: stress positions, sleep deprivation, isolation, even the sensation of drowning. It was designed as a shield to inoculate the prisoner, to help him survive the worst. And after September 11th, 2001, that shield was quietly turned inside out. According to the United States Senate's own investigation, released in 2014, the Central Intelligence Agency hired psychologists tied to the SERE program and used its resistance techniques as the blueprint for an interrogation program, reverse engineering a course built to help Americans survive torture into a method for inflicting it on detainees. The agency paid a company founded by two of those psychologists more than $80 million. The school James Rowe built to protect his country's soldiers became, in other hands, the template for something the country has spent 20 years trying not to look at directly. Rowe himself never saw that final twist. By the late 1980s, he was a colonel, running a counterinsurgency advisory mission in the Philippines, still doing the quiet, dangerous work that had defined his entire life. On April 21st, 1989, communist insurgents ambushed his car on a Manila street and shot him to death. The man who survived 5 years in a Viet Cong cage was killed in traffic by an enemy who knew exactly who he was and exactly what he had built. He is buried at Arlington. Most Americans have never heard his name. So here is the question worth carrying out of this file. We took one man's worst 4 days, the desperate run that ended 5 years in a swamp, and we turned them into a permanent institution, a school that has shaped tens of thousands of soldiers since. We learned everything he had to teach us about how to survive the unthinkable. And then a handful of people took that same hard-won knowledge and used it to do the unthinkable to someone else. What does it say about us that the very lessons a hero bled for can be picked up, turned around, and aimed in the opposite direction, and that the man who paid for them in 5 years of darkness never even got to object? Subscribe to Phantom Directive. Tell us in the comments whether you had ever heard the name James Rowe before tonight, and which forgotten soldier you believe history has buried too quietly. Because the file on the men who came back is open only a crack. And a door that opens only a crack is a door that can always be quietly closed again.